Fears of radiation spreading outside of Japan are already beginning to circle. Reports say that a radiation plume is to reach California by tomorrow. The FDA has announced that it will be monitoring food imported from Japan for radiation. And now people are wondering if the world's food supply could be at risk. Financial markets are also echoing those fears. So as the world watches and waits, we have to wonder if some of the disruptions on a global scale could have been avoided. If we've created an industrial chain that puts us all at risk, no matter where an earthquake or tsunami may strike. Here to discuss it with us is Lynn, Director of New America's Markets, Enterprise and Resiliency Initiative, and also author of the book, End of the Line, The Rise and Coming Fall of the Global Corporation. Barry, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Now, let's look at what's going on in Japan, of course. How is this going to end up affecting the world financially? Of course, this entire situation is still developing, but the markets have been up and down like a roller coaster. Now we hear that perhaps world food supplies may be contaminated. How can we see this playing out?
Well, at this point, it's way too early to really figure out how bad it's going to be, and that's because we still don't know two things. We don't know whether there's going to be a meltdown, which will make the situation much worse, and we also don't know how bad the disruptions are within the industrial system. It's going to take us weeks, if not months, to really figure out how disrupted these systems were.
But what are we seeing already come into play at the moment, right, as certain companies tell their employees to leave the country, to leave Japan?
Well, what we're seeing right now is that, you know, if you didn't have the nuclear crisis, these companies would be rushing experts from outside the country into Japan to help fix the systems, the machinery that was knocked over, that was knocked out. And what they're doing is the exact opposite right now. So what we're seeing is that a situation that we should be making better is, at least for the time being, is going to be, no matter what, it's going to be getting worse.
But is this something that you can say is unique to the situation in Japan and to this earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear fallout, or any time now around the world when we have this kind of disaster that strikes, especially in a more developed country, right, especially one of the top economies in the world? Does it send this chain reaction globally?
Yes, I mean, we live in a world that is radically different than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, every country pretty much had its own industrial system, and there was very little integration among nations. What we now have is a system that's basically shared by all of the nations together, and there's certain beauty to that, but there's also a major problem, which is that whenever there's a major impact, a shock, one place in the world, it could be in Taiwan, could be in Korea, could be in India and China, that shock then is transmitted every place almost instantaneously. And
is that an accident? I mean, is that the way that the globalization and this industrial system was supposed to work? Wasn't it supposed to give us more flexibility rather than make us more vulnerable?
Well, that's the thing, is like people really expected when we started this process of globalization that we'd end up bringing more players into the system, we'd have more flexibility, and the exact opposite happened because we made a couple of mistakes. One is that we stopped, as nations, we stopped thinking about our dependencies overseas. And that was very different than we had been before. In earlier days, all nations had said, well, we're going to have at least 2 or 3 suppliers for whatever important things that we need. And also, in many of our countries, we stopped enforcing our anti-monopoly laws. So before that, we would have 4, 5, or 6 local sources of some product. Now, in many countries, we only have 1. So put these two together, and we went from a system where you would have had many, many options to a system where often you only have 1 source of supply.
And do you think that we see that, too, especially when it comes to the energy industry, be it the nuclear energy or coal or natural gas?
Well, you know, the funny thing about energy is that energy is a much more resilient system. Oil, even though we really view oil as a major strategic issue, and we sort of send entire fleets into the various parts of the world to ensure that we have this flow of oil. The fact is that you can cut off any major source of oil and the world system would remain largely untouched. With the industrial system, by contrast, we've allowed for much greater specialization. We have much higher risk within the industrial system.
So how do we go about fixing that? You know, is it too late? Are we too far into this game, too deep?
Well, you know, it's not easy to fix. I mean, the simple idea would be to figure out what we want. And what we want is a resilient system. We want a system that if there's an earthquake someplace or there's a revolution in China tomorrow, we want to make sure that that revolution doesn't take place in the middle of the industrial system on which we depend. So the goal is to make sure that whether it's a particular chip, whether it's a particular chemical, that we always have 3, 4, 5 different places where we're sourcing that chip or that chemical. None of them have to be here in the United States. None of them have to be in any one particular country. You just need to spread it out.
Except, of course, the problem is that even if you have it in more than one country, it's probably just going to be one company that controls it all, isn't it? Barry, I want to thank you very much for joining us. And, of course, we'll continue to monitor this situation in Japan, but we are now seeing some of the faults of this system. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.